Hello and a very warm welcome wherever you are tuned in. You're watching Primetime Live. It's always a pleasure to have you joining us on the show. My name is Flora Kaitesi. Now, the 27th African Union Summit is just around the corner. It's a few days away. And like you may have seen right here on Rwanda Television, we're running a series of programs in the run-up to the African Union Summit. Now, today's discussion will center around achieving an integrated Africa. And we're going to examine whether this is a reality, what should be done to give this idea some traction, what should be going through the minds of policymakers during the African Union Summit, especially in as far as Agenda 2063 is concerned, which is championing for a peaceful, prosperous and integrated Africa. And to help us getting this discussion on the road, I'm glad to be joined by Leonard Mugarire, who is the Regional Integration Advisor. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Flora.
Geoffrey Manyara, did I get that right?
Yes, right. Yeah.
He's Economic Affairs Tourism at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And of course, Gonza, good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Flora.
He's a commentator on current affairs. I hope I got that right.
I think so.
Yeah. Welcome to the program, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Now, over the years, we've seen different levels, or rather, different levels of performance of regional blocs across the African continent and their existence in as far as integration is concerned. I'm just going to outline a few examples. In the East African community, I was reading earlier, the most recent article that I saw was calling for women to participate more meaningfully in the integration process. And then if we look further west, the Economic Community for West African States, ECOWAS, just recently, the former Nigerian president, Olusegun Obasanjo, had tasked the new president of the ECOWAS Commission to ensure economic integration among the member countries. And then if we look at another example down south in SADC, there's talk that member countries need to establish more joint investments in areas like energy and water. Here's why I'm outlining these examples. They have one thing in common, which is integration. Yeah? But then all these blocks have existed for a certain amount of time. And it begs the question, what kind of preconditions do we need on the continent to achieve an integrated Africa? I'll start with you, Leonard.
Thank you, Flora. I think the premise upon which you started, which is an integrated Africa, we're increasingly witnessing an integrated Africa, and the reasons abound for all of us to see. From east to west, south, north, we are increasingly seeing free movement of people, specifically in the East African community, and this is underpinned by strong leadership. To your question, what is the reason behind this? This is underpinned by strong leadership and a lot of political energy that we are seeing across the continent. We are seeing deliberate action by African leaders calling for sustained implementation of commitments, and this is starting to bear results. To your earlier comment about an article you read, I also recently read an article by The Economist citing the EAC as a successful example of the regional integration agenda. And what we are trying to do, and I'll use the example of the East African community in as far as promoting women in trade, is increasingly involve them and include them in initiatives and programs that we design, for example, women in trade, women in informal cross-border trade. We sensitize them, we train them, we train them on simplified trade regime, for example, and we're starting to see that this is bearing results. Is it enough? My sense is no. We need to sustain the momentum. We need to be more deliberate.
Which is why I think even when we look at the former Nigerian president's concerns that this is a bloc that has existed for 41 years, but they're still talking about the same idea of integration. Gonza, you are an observer of such matters. What do you think are those preconditions that Africa needs in order to achieve an integrated continent? And for blocks like those ones that have existed for a very long time, but they're still not getting there. And Leonard is saying that it's still not enough. Do we need to revisit them?
I mean, the issue is the lack of urgency in the leadership, because in some of the blocks, because when you look at the development challenge we face in Africa and the need for integration as one of the solutions or the ways towards quick development, there must be a serious sense of urgency, and it's because some of the regional blocks, they have lacked people to drive them seriously, be able to take national sacrifices. A country must take sacrifices so that for the benefit of the region. The achievements we have witnessed in a couple of last years in the East African community is because the leaders decided that we need to move these things fast. I don't even think that they are even moving at it's impressive given the past, but still it's not as much. So we need that particular urgency across the continent.
There isn't sufficient political will. It's not uniform across the continent.
Yeah, it's not uniform across the continent. In some areas, there is that belief and will. In others, there's even the lack of intellectual articulation of what is at stake, what has to be done. There was a time when people started talking about integration of Africa in the 60s. It's because there were particular leaders who could stand up and say, this is what we have to do. They would speak with conviction, and even the masses would get a feel. Everybody used to become a Nkrumahist, and people were talking about the need for Africa Unite, Africa Unite. We need also that inspiration leadership in part of the continent where
Geoffrey,
it is lacking.
please jump in and tell us what your assessment of the performance of these blocks is.
Yeah, thanks. I think Leonard has really captured it. But for me, I also think that we need to go beyond and encourage a meaningful interaction of people within the continent. I'm a tourism person, and I see tourism playing a big role in that sense. If we encourage people to travel, they interact with each other, they break all the stereotypes. Because the problem we have in Africa is there is minimum movement of people within the continent, of course, because of the barriers that exist. And of course, this is where the political issue comes in. But once those things are removed, then I think we can have a faster integration within Africa.
And indeed, this leads me to my next question, because critics say that Africa is not competitive enough.
Yes.
Do you think, African leaders are paying attention to this issue in as far as creating that integration is concerned? Leonard, what is your take on that?
I think leaders across the continent are increasingly paying attention to integrating Africa and fast enough. There's an increased sense of urgency and the way business is done. Let me use again the example of the EAC, where we all know that one size perhaps may not fit, and the leaders decided, you know what, let's use the variable geometry, the flexibilities it gives us to use the Northern Corridor Integration Project Summit to fast track and accelerate the implementation of select EAC projects. And we have seen the results when leaders decide it's time for us to actually get down to business and deliver results to citizens, to people. After all, development is really about people, integration is about people. The AU 2063 agenda is about people and Africans connecting. And just to cite a few examples, when it comes to travel within the EAC, I can now use my ID to travel to Entebbe, to Mombasa, to Nairobi, to the 3 partner states. We're hoping that we can have the same reciprocity in Burundi and the United Republic of Tanzania soon. But we're also accelerating the implementation of hard infrastructure, power connectivity, energy, railway, the standard gauge railway from Mombasa, and this same energy and speed is being replicated across this central corridor. With a new dispensation in United Republic of Tanzania, we're seeing an increased sense of urgency, and the leaders saying, let's get down to business, let's deliver meaningful results that will further connect our people.
But I'd like to pick your brains on something. I mean, judging from what you're saying, in this part of Africa, it feels like it's working for the East African community, irrespective of the challenges. But then I'm thinking, do you think it would be a far-fetched dream to say that the blocks could work together to achieve what we're talking about here, an integrated Africa? Is that possible?
You're talking about the regional economic communities that we have. I know we do have the minimum integration program under the African Union, which is looking at sort of building blocks so that eventually all the regional economic communities will come together as one, so that we're integrated as one continent. I don't think it's a pipe dream. It's something that is possible. It can happen, and especially if there's goodwill at the political level, our leaders and so forth, to steer this through. But again, the question, maybe to go back to what you talked about, the issue of competitiveness. We know that Africa constantly ranks, the ranking is quite low when compared with ourselves, say, for example, with Asia and so forth. And this is where now the leaders have got to pay attention to. When you talk about the issues of competitiveness, for example, doing business in Africa, all these things, talking about intra-African regional trade, which is very, very minimal, and we need to sort of think of ways to encourage that. I think that's when we start looking at ways to achieve or speed up the regional integration within the African continent. Once all the barriers are addressed, tariff and non-tariff barriers, for example, it is possible for us to achieve meaningful integration within Africa.
Gonza, please pick up on the question of competitiveness. Critics say African countries are not competitive enough.
I think integration would be one of the ways to achieve greater competitiveness, because if there's movement of people, it means even the companies that are operating within Africa have a bigger talent pool, have better experiences interchanging with each other, so that they are able to compete on the international market. Integration should be. And because the conditions that are required when you are integrating also free up the internal markets, the regulations or the obstacles that usually exist in our individual countries are freed up, and allows our entrepreneurs, because the leaders may do their part, but the entrepreneurs would have the final say. They would decide exactly if everything that is put in place is utilized to deliver jobs and services. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when we talk about an integrated Africa, it's of course inevitable. We have to discuss about what you were raising, the free movement of people. Now, I'd like to again illustrate something here. The recent Africa Visa Openness Index indicated that Africa is still closed off to African travelers. On average, Africans need visas to travel to 55% of other African countries. You're nodding, you're in the tourism industry, so you really understand what I'm talking about here. Yeah. They can have visas on arrival in only 25%, and they don't need a visa to travel to only 20% of African countries. And these restrictions, of course, negatively impact tourism, investment, and trade. Your comments?
I think those facts are real. We face them across the continent. It is frustrating for an African to travel across the continent, and yet for non-African, it is much easier for them to move from North Africa to Central Africa to West Africa to East Africa. And so the statistics point to a huge issue that only leaders and policymakers can actually address. And I think the upcoming AU summit in Kigali presents a perfect platform for leaders to actually discuss these issues openly and decide, let's get rid of these visas. And a few countries have demonstrated that it's actually possible. Mauritius is an example, Seychelles, Ghana most recently. In the EAC, we have perfect examples. Rwanda relaxed its visa regimes a few years back, and we're starting to reap the benefits, which basically have resulted in increased tourist arrivals, in increased spending, and the fears that we often cite about terrorism or counterterrorism can be mitigated by leveraging tools like ICT to track terrorists.
I'd like to come back on the issue of the bottlenecks to integration. Then we can bring up the issues of security and what have you. But during the African Union Summit, we're expecting to see the launch of the African passport. Do you think it's enough?
No, it's not enough because I don't know how many people would access it. But I usually wonder what is so affecting some of our leaders, not affect some of the things which are very straightforward, like the issue of the visas, because it is straightforward, the benefits are obvious. I think some of our people are still stuck in the past. Psychologically, some of the countries we have on the continent have leadership which are still stuck in the past. They're in a cocoon. They think maybe their regimes are threatened and so on. So we also have to look at critically at the issues of governance in part of the continent, because that's where you have to give hope to the young people, because they're the ones who are going to move forward all the processes of integration and transform the continent. And if they don't feel that they are involved enough, then we may still have a problem somehow, somewhere.
Would you like to add something?
I'd like to pick up on the issue of youth. The good news, the youth are increasingly engaged, and the vast majority of youth across the continent have petitioned heads of state to actually launch this African passport and to abolish visas. We are hopeful that the heads of state and government will actually consider this petition. To your question about is the AU passport enough? Perhaps not. I think the bigger question is, do we have the right mindset and the receptivity to change and to actually believe that we can freely move across the continent without these physical borders and barriers that we have in our minds created. I think it starts with what we believe is possible. And the cases that I've cited on the continent that have tried successfully demonstrate that it's actually possible if we continue having this conversation. So for me, it's really a question of mindset and the willingness to actually do it.
From let me just add on something to that. From where you sit as a regional integration advisor, can you just in a few words illustrate the kind of potential benefits that come with relaxing, say, visa openness and things like that?
The first benefit is increased travel across blocks, across the continent. Increased travel means that there's increased spending on air travel. It means there's increased spending on tourism. Wherever you go, if I decide to go to Mauritius, if I decide to go to South Africa, I will definitely spend on transport, I'll spend on accommodation, I'll spend on leisure, and so many other things. But also relaxing visas, as my second point, increases talent mobility across the continent. Meaning I can take up jobs in Cameroon without needing visas. I can go and compete for jobs there. I can take up jobs in Tanzania or elsewhere on the continent, like we have seen happening in the EU, notwithstanding the issues of Brexit. So to your question, for me, the benefits far outweigh the costs.
Outweigh the costs.
Yeah.
Geoffrey, your area is on tourism planning, policy formulation, and what have you. And of course, effectively harnessing the region's tourism potential. But it's obviously difficult without integration. So I'd like you to talk to us about how far you think integration can go in unlocking Africa's tourism potential.
Yeah, thanks. I think let's start with the facts first. Globally, there are about 1.2 billion visitors. Africa receives only about 5% of that. It's about 56 million. The norm is that you should have 80% of your international visitors coming from the region. That is the norm. I give the example of a country like Malaysia. Malaysia receives 27 million visitors a year, as of last year. About 13 million of those come from Singapore alone. And I'm not even talking about the other countries. So regional tourism is very, very important for any destination, and for Africa, for that matter. Now, for us to achieve meaningful integration, it means that we have to ensure that we get 80% of our arrivals coming from Africa. And that is when we start seeing the meaningful benefits of tourism. Now, what is the problem we're having here? The problem you're having is that if you look at a country like, say compare Rwanda and Uganda, what sort of tourism are they trying to sell to visitors? You have the gorillas in Rwanda, you have the gorillas in Uganda, and so forth. Basically, the tourism products tend to be very similar. They're not being aligned to the regional markets. And now this is mostly down to the colonial legacy, because we were primarily meant to be producers of raw materials, and African destinations were meant to serve the Western clientele. It's very, very rare that they were meant to serve the African tourist. So now we are faced with a challenge whereby we're having a growing middle class within the African continent. And what do? They have money to spend. What do? They go to Dubai, they go to, we're losing out on this potential market because we don't have, or we've not really aligned our products towards. And the other problem, again, we talked about is the issue of the visas. If you want to go to Ethiopia, for example, as a Rwandan person, you must apply for your visa before traveling into Ethiopia. These are some of the challenges we're talking about. Now, that cannot encourage regional tourism, and that's when we're happy that this discussion that will take place about the African passport will perhaps address some of these challenges we're facing. And the thing is, we're saying here is that we see, or from where I see tourism as a potential vehicle to speeding up regional integration within Africa. Because the more and more people travel, and by the way, when you compare, say, for example, the United Kingdom and France, for example, it is an assumption I'm making here that the more you have people traveling, the corresponding trade levels. I'm trying to look for the word here. Tourism can encourage trade, because when you travel, you interact with people, exchange of ideas, and you begin to realize there's some things that you can do, maybe, and that sort of thing. And that, to me, I think is a way of encouraging trade within the African continent.
We're about to take a short break, but
Yes.
I'd like Gonza to come in here. I mean, listening to those to the kinds of challenges that he's talking about, and then you look on the other side and you wonder, have the African leaders been aware fast enough of that potential and of dealing with those challenges? What would be your
it's
analysis
not just
about
the leader.
that?
I mean, what he has just said astounds me. I mean, how
is that possible?
How is this possible? It's not just the leaders, also everybody, all the entrepreneurs who are involved, all the people, because we all have contributions, and that shows that we have lagged behind for a long time. We can't miss opportunities that are there now. It's talked about so often. Why there's no intra-Africa trade? Why is it so limited? This is exactly the example. Because people have to target also. See, if you are, let's say in Rwanda, you want to target tourists from the neighboring countries. What is the product? The leaders have already allowed free movement of people, so it's up to the business people to deliver product that people need. There's some people usually talk about weekend lifestyles, the nightlife, and so on, how to meet and interact. You don't need, I mean, most likely I will never pay to go and watch gorillas. So I need a certain type of attraction. And if it's there, it's very easy for people to move around. So what are we as entrepreneurs, or everybody else, everybody watching, what are we doing to tap that potential that is
Indeed,
on us?
Gonza says that it's long overdue. Entrepreneurs should wake up, smell the coffee, and tap into the opportunities. We're going to take a short break now. We'll be right back after this. Don't go away. Welcome back. If you're joining us, you're watching Primetime Live. My name is Flora Kaitesi, and today we're discussing integrated Africa. Remember, you can join the conversation by using our hashtag Primetime Live. My Twitter handle is @Flora Kaitesi, and then you can speak to us or ask any questions. For now, we have Irene Kimenyi, who says that the panelists need to also discuss the challenges to integration. I think we're just about to get into that. We have Brian Barkley. Okay, I lost that one. We'll just continue, then we'll get back to social media in a moment. Now, when we talk about integrated Africa, of course, there are challenges. And one of the most sticking ones is about transport. And the example that I'm going to shoot to you is about airline transport. We know that Africa has some of the highest air fares in the world. And this, of course, presents a challenge to integration. And like you had said, the urgency is there. The time is now. Africa has to move now. The status quo must change. We must achieve that prosperity that we want. So how do we address issues like this, Leonard?
Good question. I think air travel for the longest time has been prohibitively expensive for most Africans. And the good news is leaders have acknowledged this, and they're saying it's not enough for us to say we're going to implement declarations that we committed to 20 years ago, but actually saying this is the time to do this. And I will again use the EAC example through the Northern Corridor Integration Project Summit, where the leaders basically decided that, amongst the 14 plus projects they decided to prioritize includes aviation. And the decision was made to negotiate bilateral air service agreements between Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda. And what we have seen 2 years later, since the initiative was born, is the fifth freedoms, or the right to travel or carry passengers from one country to another and pick from another third country to another. So we are seeing, for example, Rwandair picking passengers from Entebbe to Nairobi, and we are seeing the vice versa, Kenya Airways doing the same. What this has done is it has fostered competition, and it has also reduced the cost of air travel. It used to cost close to $800 to travel from Entebbe to Nairobi because it was only one airline operating it. Now, with increased competition, it's between $300 and $400. So, yes, we have a long way to go. Even $300, $400 for a 40, 50-minute flight is way on the high side.
Very high, yeah.
But imagine a drastic reduction of about 50%. So we have a long way to go. My sense is it's going to go down if we continue this momentum and energy that we're seeing.
Geoffrey, please jump in, because we find in many cases, like he was mentioning, the airfares, they're still very high, and people resort to using buses or road transport, it takes a long time and it's tedious, and it impacts in areas such as yours, tourism.
Well, in a nice way, really, because actually we encourage people to travel by road, not by air, because then in terms of benefits, you tend to, because the thing is that it is true that the cost of travel within Africa is quite high. But what we're seeing now with, for example, the Northern Corridor transport infrastructure development and so forth, we have good roads in Africa now. Within the East African community, for example, you can drive from here to Nairobi easily, to Mombasa, to Arusha, to Dar es Salaam, and so forth. Car ownership has grown tremendously. A lot of people own cars within the East African community, within Africa now. In fact, it is even a challenge because of the traffic jams. That's a clear sign that, So the thing is that we need to move people away from, for us to encourage people, we need to move people away from the perception that air transport is expensive, and encourage them to actually use other means of transport. I give the example, for example, in Europe, why is tourism booming? It's not because of, first of all, air transport is cheap, but the majority of people actually use land transport, trains and by car.
But people are also looking for convenience.
Yes, they're looking for convenience, yes. But
cheap convenience, actually.
But if you look at, from where I come from a tourism perspective, really, I think people need to know about, for example, if you live in Kigali, you need to know about the towns in Uganda. If you travel, say, to Mbarara, to Masaka, to Kampala, to Jinja, that's in kind, because if you fly, then you miss out on that. You get the point? And that is one of the ways of, you talk about regional integration. I think, to me, if we have this infrastructure program fully implemented, we have the Cape to Cairo, for example, transport corridor. It means that you can actually drive from South Africa to Egypt.
I feel like you're saying the fact that airfares are too high is okay. It's a non-issue.
No. It's not okay. It is also a challenge. But I'm just saying, in as much as it's a challenge, there's also another opportunity that we need to exploit. The cost of air transport, for example, is down to several issues. These bilateral agreements and so forth, but also the issue of connectivity. The airport, the air transport infrastructure itself is quite limiting. The reason, for example, why in Europe these low-cost carriers, why they've thrived, is because they don't fly to the main airports, for example, of cities. They go to other airports where the cost of landing and so forth is lower. We do not have the same here in Africa. We only have very limited infrastructure.
Gonza, please come in and just tell us what you think should feature in discussions, especially at the African Union level, with regards to...
the little progress that has been achieved in the northern, I call it little, but it could be big in the northern corridor, integration framework should be replicated in many other African countries, because there is still that space. So exactly, can the leaders in East Africa, can President Kagame showcase to other African leaders, say, we have at least moved this step. Can you do it in the Congo, in Central Africa, can you do it in West Africa, and so on? Because if it could, only that, And there's that agreement on joint investments in infrastructure that facilitate transport in different areas. Because, I mean, look at the Congo. It's very vast and very unexploited. I mean, people would love to move there and do business and so on. So if the example of the East African Community could be shown, could be replicated across the continent, that would be very serious progress.
Another challenge that we have seen is, of course, security, and there's still pockets of instability within Africa. The nearest to us actually is Burundi, and I remember just the other day in Kenya, it's the US that issued a travel advisory. Of course, it's not the first one, but how do we get past these issues?
For security, I insisted to be related with governance, because he was talking about the new administration in Tanzania, which has actually allowed some progress. That means there was a misunderstanding with the previous government with the federal leaders in the region. The same with Burundi, because the region is not, the country is not pushing at the same pace with the rest. It goes back to governance. If there is an individual in many African countries, it is very sad. We still have like more than maybe 15 life presidents on the continent. If they are willing to sacrifice the interests of their countries and the region and the continent at large for regime survival, that means many things will not be achieved. Many things will not be achieved. And the citizens who notice that the opportunities are being limited, they resort to violence. It's not surprising. If people are being suppressed or somewhere, or their regions are neglected, they even withdraw. There are some cases where people may withdraw to their ethnic cocoons instead of looking at the broader perspective. The need for...
Leonard, is what Gonza saying school of thought you conform to?
I think integration, or rather deeper integration, allows for countries, in this particular case, African countries, to trust each other and live brotherly in a sisterly way, and we're increasingly seeing this. We're increasingly seeing this in the East African community. For example, we have an East African standby brigade that will be deployed should there be any security situation that warrants its deployment. We're also seeing increased collaboration amongst our security and intelligence apparatus, sharing intelligence across borders, Interpol sharing intelligence across the region and across the continent. Recently in Entebbe, there was a regional summit on counterterrorism, which attracted heads of state from the region and afar, Prime Minister of Israel, which demonstrate that security is of paramount importance for regional integration to thrive. We need security, we need peace, and deepening and accelerating regional integration, trade, social, will also ultimately allow for deeper trust. We have seen less wars in the EU because of the connection that they have. So for me, I think whereas we have a few pockets of instability and incidents here and there, I think we are seeing collective will and responsibility from leaders to actually address the issue.
I mean, there's a point I don't buy so much, because it's not about the issue of trust. The mechanism is talking about they are good, but they are not addressing the root cause. The example of the European Union, there is a standard of democracy that is expected across the continent, the European continent. All new members, they have to meet a certain criteria. Here we need that. At the turn of the century, when they were thinking, the African leaders were thinking about the African Union transition from OAU to AU, there was a mechanism which they called NEPAD, and because they understood there was need to also address issues of governance. Even if it would have been based on peer review, I personally think it was a failure. It has not sorted out the core governance issues that are needed. So the African Union has to look again at that, because you cannot, even if you deploy the best security services and so on, they play a role. If you don't address the grievances that exist in certain communities, one of the targets at which is silencing guns in the Agenda 2063, I think it will be just in the sky. It will be a pipe.
Yeah.
Geoffrey is nodding. You seem to agree with what Gonza
well, I
saying.
agree. I was also going to touch on the issue of travel advisories and how they impact the tourism industry in Africa.
Fact, some say that some of those travel advisories are exaggerated.
Well, put it this way: if I'm, say, a French citizen, for example, I will listen more to what my foreign ministry has to tell me about the destination I'm traveling to. Now, I would not blame France for putting, laying the travel advisories. They're taking care of the welfare of their citizens, and they will, go to any extra whatever length to try and do that, whether the information is accurate or not, because they don't want to take chances. But for me, what I'm trying to say about the travel advisories is that we need to also. I give the example. There was a terrorist attack in France. Just, I think, a couple of, and I'm not sure how many African states issue travel advisories to their citizens to go to France. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the reason why perhaps France would recover faster from that problem is because of regional tourism, which we lack here. And that's why, for example, in the case of Kenya, when we had all these problems in 2013 and so forth, it was very difficult for us to recover because of the same countries issuing travel advisories, or the same countries we're targeting for our tourists. Now, if for example, regional tourism was booming, regional tourists are more informed or more aware about what is going on within the region. And in fact, one of the things that saved Kenya's tourism was domestic tourism. Because domestic tourists are very aware. The situation has changed. They have first-hand information and so forth. And I think that's what we need to start thinking about within the African continent. Because the travel advisory is always going to be there. Mm-hmm. So we need to start having a different approach to dealing with this particular problem.
And I'd like to, because we're running out of time, but I'd like to go back to something that Gonza had raised. And I'd like to pick your brain on what your assessment would be in the AU's work or efforts to unite Africans. And here's why I'm saying this. The other day when President Kagame was in Ethiopia, he received an honorary degree. And he said something that, piqued my interest. He likes to say this, but he was saying this not to Rwandan youth, but Ethiopian youth, and of course through them to African youth, about the need to always strive to unite the African people. But then the AU is who we look up to unite the African people. So I just want to hear your opinion about what the efforts of the AU have been in as far as uniting Africans and then consequently achieving that integration that we want.
No, they could have done more. Over the years, they could have done better. And because, at one stage they chose to be a club of the leaders instead of the people. There's now a conscience that they need to change that. They have moved a few steps. In some steps they have blatantly failed, because when you look at the people they choose to chair the African Union, it's usually a sad spectacle, and they don't take into consideration the reasons. I was talking about the different areas where governance is failing. When you look at the countries where young people come from and are trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe, there are particular countries where there's a problem, like Eritrea. And you find the African Union never says anything. Me, as a young person watching, and I see my fellow people trying to go to Europe, because in their own countries the situation is very dire, and the African Union is quiet, and they are not proactive. I look at the situation in Burundi, and the performance of the regional integration groups and the African Union and so on have been very, very mediocre and very disappointing, because everybody is trying to protect themselves. Every government on the continent tries to protect themselves. So if there is not, we haven't moved beyond that stage where everything seems as if the interest of the existing regimes across the continent go beyond what would otherwise be the primary interests, which are the interests of the people. Then people will perceive that their call for unity is not genuine.
And I'll consider that your parting shot. He believes that the African Union can do better in as far as uniting Africans is concerned. What are your thoughts?
I think there's increased optimism across the continent. Africa is growing. There's a demographic dividend that can be harnessed, and I think while the AU has laid a good foundation, largely driven by demanding leaders who are actually pushing an Africa agenda, the 2063 agenda that you alluded to earlier in your opening statements. And it's through that leadership that we're actually going to further unite Africans. And the second thing that for me is quite promising is that citizens across the continent are very positive. They are encouraged, they are positive about what the future holds and the promise that the future holds. And I think what needs to happen is an accelerated pace of the way business is done, and dose of sense of urgency infused beyond just political leaders, but to policymakers and to civil society, and a lot more inclusiveness. And lastly, to address the issue of infrastructure, which is a bottleneck, we need more public-private partnerships to really address this issue that is holding intra-African trade behind.
Geoffrey, your closing remarks in as far as the AU's efforts are concerned in uniting Africans?
I think we must acknowledge some of the efforts of the AU as undertaken towards integrating Africa. These issues to do with the African Union passport, I think, is quite commendable, and I'm hoping it's something that's going to open up Africa. And with that, they need to go a step further. For example, in Kenya, there's something they're calling Tembea Kenya. We need to have something like Tembea Africa, Travel Africa, so that people travel within the African continent, and that we will get to understand each other, break down the stereotypes that may exist and so forth, and it's that through that we can achieve meaningful integration within Africa.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're going to have to stop there for now, but we hope that the discussions we've had here have shed more light on what we expect to hear at the African Union Summit, hoping that the leaders there will address or will attempt to address some of the issues that have been raised. Thank you so much, Leonard, for being with us. You are the Regional Integration Advisor. Geoffrey Manyara, the Economic Affairs of Tourism at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And Gonza Muganwa, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you too.
My name is Flora Kaitesi. Next is the news. We'll see you next time.